Okay, hello everybody and a very good morning to all of you. Welcome to day 2 of Charcha 2020. Charcha 2020 aims to bring the development sector of the country and overseas to address some of the most challenging issues we are facing today. You are currently tuned into the civil society and prosperity track, and we have a great lineup of sessions today, ranging from politics of romance to how liberty has taken people out of poverty to panel discussions on trust deficit, cash transfers, etc. etc. I recommend you all to check out the Attendify app after this session to know more about the chronology and the session details. To start the track today, the first session is on public choice, politics of romance. The session is part of the flagship course taken by Center for Civil Society called I-Policy. Now, one may ask, what is an I-Policy? CCS as part of their policy training programs conduct introductory courses to public policy, which are useful in understanding policy from a liberal point of view. Post the pandemic, we have pivoted our operations online and conduct e-policies. For more information on e-policy and other programs, you can check out CCS's website. Coming back to Charcha. The first session, Politics of Romance, Public Choice, is a 40 plus 15-minute session. That ideally means you can put your questions in the Q&A box presented down at your screen and keep asking questions while Yazad is speaking, who is also the first speaker of the day. We will take some of the questions live in the session by the end. Raising curtains, we welcome our first speaker of the day, Yazad Jal. Yazad Jal is currently the director of CCS Academy at the Center for Civil Society. In this role, he creates, develops, and manages all training and education-related programs of the center, including the I-Policy I had just mentioned. Previously, Yazad was a fellow, economic policy, and managed the technology and policy program at the Takshashila Institute, Bangalore. Before that, he worked as a management consultant in the United States for 10 years with McKinsey & Company, IBM's Global Business Services, and his own independent consultancy. Yazad has also been active in the non-profit sector in India, serving as CEO of Praja Foundation in Mumbai from 2002 to 2006. Yazad has an MBA from Yale University and a BA Economics from St. Xavier's College, Mumbai Universities. We welcome you, Yazad, and now over to you.
Thank you so much, Astha. I hope the screen is visible.
Yes, it is.
Thank you. So today I'm going to be talking on politics without romance. It's an introduction to public choice. And as you can see, I'm a great fan of Calvin and Hobbes comics, so you'll see a few of them through this session. So let's start. Let's start by asking a simple question. What is public policy? Why is it important? So public policy at its basic level are courses of action, regulatory measures, laws, funding priorities that concern a given topic. That's important. You have a given topic or a given goal, and it's promulgated by a governmental entity or its representatives. So it's important for public policy to be really public. It has to be done by the government. So if you look at the cartoon on the side, you see there are a lot of people outside the government building who are doing all the analysis, but it's the person inside the government building who actually will enable and implement this public policy. So public policy is one of the routes to collective action. You have a goal that you want to achieve, say the goal is poverty alleviation. So one route to action is public policy. Another route is the community. A third route is the market. And these are all different routes to collective action. You can classify public policy as what we call the political market, while the other two are what we call the private market. So who are the players? When we are talking about policy, when we are talking about these various routes to collective action, who are the players in this game in some sense? So the first players, of course, they are businesses, they're consumers, politicians, bureaucrats, and voters. So these are the main players we have in these markets. And you would see businesses and consumers are part of the private market, and politicians, bureaucrats, and voters are part of the public market or the political market. When we want to talk about public policy, we also want to know what motivates people. Why do some people want to join public policy? Why do some people want to serve the country? So the traditional view is that there are dual motivations in public and private markets. What's the motivation of the public market? It's of service. It's of, national interest. These are the motivations, the higher motivation in some sense in public markets. The motivation in a private market, greed, money, profits. That's what we think right now. These are the motivations in public and private markets. There is another school of thought called public choice, which talks about a simple mantra: people are people. And they make some realistic assumptions on what motivates people. The first one is that players in government are just as self-interested as players in the market. Everybody tries to economize. So everybody wants to get the best possible outcome with the least possible cost. And finally, people have limited knowledge and limited benevolence. Even the most powerful minister or the most powerful secretary doesn't have complete knowledge of what's going on the ground. We saw that quite starkly when we have all these migrant workers. And that was an unseen consequence. The government obviously didn't see that there would be so many migrant workers wanting to go home when they called for the lockdown. So people have limited knowledge, and that's true everywhere. And limited benevolence. You would like to help as many people as you want, but there is a limit to that as well. And that's a limit that even governments have to follow. So I'm talking about public choice. So let's ask, what is public choice? Public choice or public choice theory is the use of economic tools to deal with the traditional problems of political science. So it's to use these tools to look at politics and how our interactions with politicians and bureaucrats work out. Why is that important? Because for any economic policy to be successful, it needs to go through the political process. So it's important to understand the political process. And a series of economists, starting with James Buchanan, who's pictured here, and his colleague Gordon Tullock, worked out that analyzing political processes using economic tools was very valuable, and they were able to get a good amount of analysis from it. So that's what we're going to use today. We're going to give you a peek into some sense into what public choice is. This is part of a 2-hour presentation that we make during e-policy. So we're going to compress this into 40 minutes. So there is much more that we can talk about, but we have a limitation of time. So when we're looking at analyzing motivations in the political market, let's look at not just the political market, let's look at in both the markets. Let's look at the 3 I's. The first is interest. The second is incentives. And the third is information. These are 3 lenses to view how the players behave in these different markets. So let's ask the question, what's their primary interest? What's the primary interest of businesses? What's the primary interest of consumers, politicians, bureaucrats, and voters? So for businesses, it's largely obvious. We know what it is. Their primary interest is profits, money, the power, the prestige, also some amount of legacy, some amount of public good, but the main interest is profits. What's the main interest of a consumer? It's utility. You want lower prices, you want better quality, you want better service. What about politicians, bureaucrats, and voters? Let's see a video for that, for the politician first.
She withholds food from me.
Mr. President, I hate to keep jumping up and down on this,
The
but...
sex ed report.
Yes, sir.
We're going to leave it alone for a while.
Sir, when you say...
After the midterm elections.
That's a year from now.
Yeah.
We're going to stick it in a drawer?
It's a pretty incendiary report.
You don't think we have an obligation to present the information?
It's not going to play well at a PTA meeting, CJ. It says we should be teaching kids to have sex.
It does not, Mr. President. Excuse me, sir, but it does not.
Of course it doesn't. But that's how it's going to play.
The report is very direct, sir. It says withholding knowledge about having sex doesn't prevent teenagers from having sex. It prevents teenagers from having sex safely. And it says offering information about safe sex doesn't increase the rate of sex. It increases the rate of protected sex.
CJ.
We commissioned this report, Mr. President. These people are doctors. We asked them a question. How can we put it in a drawer just because we don't think people are going to like their answer?
CJ, getting it through this Congress, a body which at the moment will only give federal funding to sex education programs that teach abstinence only.
We have an enormous pulpit from which...
And we will avail ourselves of that pulpit, but we will do it after the midterm elections.
I think I understand.
So what's the primary interest of politicians? And the most important words in that video were after the midterm elections, and the president had to shout it out. So politicians want power, they want votes and all of that, but their primary interest is re-election. If they're not elected, they can do nothing. So one must remember that how much public good a politician wants to do, his focus is on re-election. What about bureaucrats and voters? What's the primary interest of a bureaucrat? We have another video.
Bernard, I want to have a word with you about Professor Marriott's article.
Yes, I think it's about time we reform local government.
Do you, Bernard?
Yes. At least I think I did. That is, I'm not wholly against it. Although there are many convincing, some might say conclusive arguments against it.
Some might indeed, Bernard.
Yes. Why?
Because, Bernard, once you create genuinely democratic local communities, it won't stop there.
Won't it?
And of course it won't. You see, once they get established, they'll insist on more power. And the politicians will be too frightened to withhold them, so you'll get regional government.
Would that matter?
Bernard, come sit down. Bernard, what happens at the moment if there is some vacant land in, say, Nottingham, and there are rival proposals for its use, you know, a hospital, a college, or an airport?
Well, we set up an interdepartmental committee. Department of Health, Department of Education, Department of Transport, Treasury, Environment. Ask for papers, hold meetings, propose, discuss, revise, report back, redraft, normal thing.
Precisely. Months of fruitful work. Leading to a mature and responsible conclusion. But if you have regional government, they decide it all in Nottingham. Probably in a couple of meetings, complete amateurs.
It is their city.
And what happens to us?
Much less work.
Yes, much less work. So little that ministers might almost be able to do it on their own. So we'd have much less power.
Well, I don't know whether I really want power.
Bernard, if the right people don't have power, do you know what happens? The wrong people get it. Politicians, councillors, ordinary voters.
But aren't they supposed to in a democracy?
This is a British democracy.
How do you mean?
British democracy recognizes that you need a system to protect the important things of life and keep them out of the hands of the barbarians. Things like the opera, Radio 3, the countryside, the law, the university, both of them. And we are that system. Gosh.
So before we go on, I want to tell you the story of CCA. So there was this department called CCA in the 1980s that sent a note to the central government saying that our salaries haven't been increased for many, many years, and we'd like to get a salary increase. And the government said, what is CCA? It's a department in Tamil Nadu, and we have no idea about it. So to give you an example, to give you a clue to what CCA is, this is the first C. So they found out that CCA actually stands for Churchill's Cigar Assistant. It was a department set up in Tiruchirappalli, Trichy in Tamil Nadu during the Second World War to supply cigars to Winston Churchill, because his normal route of getting cigars from Cuba had been stopped by the Second World War. Now, the Second World War ended in 1945. Churchill died in 1965. The department existed till 1984. So, as you could see in the video, where Sir Humphrey Appleby says, much less work. And that's where bureaucrats get their power from. The fact that they want to expand their work, their turf in some sense. So if you look at what is their primary interest, the primary interest of a bureaucrat is turf, their budget. That's where they get their power, their prestige, their legacy. Because a bureaucrat in charge of, say, the railways, a secretary of railways has the same salary as a secretary in charge of, say, museums. But the secretary in charge of the railways has a much larger budget and therefore much more power than the secretary in charge of museums. So this turf is really important for bureaucrats. That's their primary interest. What about the primary interest of voters? You've guessed it, we have another video for you. And this, to my mind, is the best video of them all.
In Tamil Nadu, no chief minister has won 2 elections in a row for the past 26 years. Can Jayalalitha break that jinx, even though she spent a stint in jail in her last term and has been increasingly out of public view? She believes she can, largely on the back of freebies, more than any that the state has seen in its competitive history of populism. To give you an idea of the scale of the Amma largesse, we've assembled here the entire lot of freebies and subsidies that she's given in her 5 years to give you an idea of what it is costing the state politically as well as economically. Starting off with the famous free mixer, grinder, and fan scheme. Combined value of these almost 9,000 crores. Then we come to free laptops to students, about 4,100 crores. Dhotis and saris, together almost 1,500 crores. Then school kits, almost 3,000 crores of this. Marriage assistance in cash, 2,537 crores in cash. Gold coins we tried to find, but most villagers have sold them. That's another 786 crores to marriage assistance. Then baby kits, 50 crores in all. Then we have a new scheme of mobile phones free to self-help groups. That's 15 crores. There's a scheme for free cycles for 289 crores and a scheme for free goats and cows, which comes to a total of 786 crores. All of this brings the value of the freebies to a whopping 21,650 crores. And this doesn't even calculate how much the state has to pay for a whole lot of subsidized Amma schemes, like the famous subsidized Amma canteens. There's also these bottles of Amma Kudineer or Amma water, Amma salt, Amma dal, Amma cement, Amma seeds. Then there's subsidized medicines sold by the Amma pharmacy. There's a greenhouse, if the camera can pan, which she builds for those in the villages who can't afford it. She pays about 2 lakhs per house. Now, apart from raising serious ethical questions about what this kind of rampant populism, this kind of rampant handouts does to an electorate, is this almost a form of an indirect bribe? The state itself is facing an immense financial strain. Tamil Nadu's debt has jumped 80% in the last 5 years. And it's gone from a revenue surplus to a revenue deficit state. Now, if she comes to power or the DMK comes to power, they're going to keep all of this and add more, raising questions as to where the money is going to come from. Now, obviously, there are taxes which earn about 1 lakh crore to Tamil Nadu, but almost a third of that comes from here, from the sale of alcohol from its official government-owned shops. That alone earned the state 30,000 crores last year, which is pretty much the value of all of this. But both parties have said that if they come to power, this is going down the drain. And that in Tamil Nadu,
Oops.
no chief minister had.
Sorry about that, but the video was over. So let's ask this question once again. What's the primary interest of voters? It's utility, but it's also government benefits, freebies, lower taxes, liberty, public good. So the important thing to look at when you're looking at what the primary interest is that it's not public good. Although it's there, some people are motivated by public good, but largely they're motivated, their primary interest of most politicians is re-election. The primary interest of most bureaucrats is enlarging their turf, their budgets. And the primary interest of most voters is to get utility, to get government benefits, to get some kind of freebie. Why is this important? Because when you're analyzing interest, we want to see what the main focus of the player is going to be. We want to be realistic about it. We don't want to be romantic and say, oh, the focus should be this or should be that. It's what it actually is. Let's move on to incentives. Before I go on, this is a quick thing. If you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A box. I will take questions once I finish the presentation, and I'd love to hear your questions. So this is an incentive. So you can see Calvin's mom saying the early bird gets the worm. It's not a big incentive for Calvin. So we have to look at what the right incentives are for the players in the markets. I'll just talk about one such incentive, and this is for voters. So you can see in this first picture, you see long lines of voters. And I can assume that most of us on this discussion have gone out and voted at some point of time, at least in our lives. What we see below are the various parties releasing their manifestos. Now I have a question for you. How many of you all have actually read the manifestos of political parties? When we ask this question in our e-policies, we generally get maybe 2 or 3 out of 30, 35 students who have actually read the political manifesto, read one party's manifesto. More than one party? Rarely will we get somebody who reads more than one party's manifesto. All the parties' manifestos? Nobody. But that's really important because, you know, when we go out to vote, you see that you have a long list of choices. And even if you have to restrict your choices to the main parties, there generally is around about 3 choices to make. Have you actually studied those choices before you go out to vote? Let's compare that with if you're buying a phone. How much time have you spent when you bought your last phone to check whether, you know, it had the right kind of specs, it had the right kind of features, whether the price was right, whether the color was right, and all of that? I had a friend who spent nearly 3 weeks on researching before buying his last phone. Have you spent that much time in researching before the last elections? Why not? It's the question to ask. The answer is because we are rationally ignorant. Because it doesn't make that much of a difference to us because our one vote is one minuscule vote amongst lakhs of people. So even if we don't vote and our politicians gets re-elected, we're happy. So what is that value of that one vote? Versus the phone is something that we value more. These are important questions, once again, that we have to deal with. So this tells us what the incentive of the voter is. Is the incentive of the voter to study the choices? Maybe not. Let's move on to the next. Let's move to information. Here I have a question to ask you all once again. How many of you all know who Taimur Ali Khan is? I have a feeling a majority of you all would know who Taimur Ali Khan is. For the rest of you all who don't know, he is Kareena Kapoor and Saif Ali Khan's little son, and he's quite a star in social media. It's a cute boy. But how many of us know details of the government programs that actually affect us? Many of us would know more about Taimur Ali Khan, and very few of us would know about government policies that actually affect us. Once again, Calvin says it correctly out here. He knows more about private lives of celebrities than about any government policies that actually affect him. He's a child. We aren't. We're adults. But do we really care to gather that information? Important question to ask. So once we have done this, checking interests, incentives, and information of all the players, we need to ask an important question. What is the appropriate role of government? Is it to solve market failure? So market failures come in four categories. One is public goods, because the market cannot supply public goods because of the free rider problem. I'm not going to go into details of this. If you want details, I would suggest you sign up for the e-policy course that we do. The second market failure is externalities. A third market failure is monopoly power. And the fourth is asymmetric information. So is this the appropriate role of government, solving market failures? Because the market obviously is not perfect. Or is it to redistribute income? Is it the role of government to help the poor? To give some income support, input subsidies, price support, minimum wage, employment guarantees, these various ways of helping the poor. Is that the role of government? Is the role of government to provide a social safety net? Healthcare, health insurance, pensions, universal basic income. The reason I ask this is, it's quite simple. Government can do only some amount of work. So what should the appropriate role of government be? What should be right up front? Once again, these are questions for us to think about and answer. This brings me on to another story by the economist Gordon Tullock. And this story goes back to a Roman emperor. So a Roman emperor was once asked to judge a singing contest between two contestants. And upon hearing the first, gave the award to the second under the assumption that the second clearly couldn't be any worse than the first. The first singer was so bad, the second singer is going to be better. What's the error here? Second singer could be worse. This is called the Nirvana Fallacy, where we listen to one choice and assume that the second choice is going to be better. Why am I talking about the Nirvana Fallacy? Because when we have market failures, we assume that the government is going to step in and do a better job. That's a dangerous assumption, as Calvin is saying out here, because we look at government as being Mai Baap Sarkar, and Calvin is saying, what assurance do you have that your parenting isn't screwing me up? What assurance do we have that governments aren't screwing up as well? So there is government failure. Government exhibits the same or similar problems as private markets. Government involvement can make problems worse. Their unintended consequences can be magnified. There is no incentive for feedback mechanisms. So if you're, for example, a sales manager in a company and you don't achieve your target, you get feedback, and the feedback is you most probably will get demoted or fired. If you achieve your targets, you get a promotion. So there are feedback mechanisms and there are incentives for those. What if you're a government officer, if you're a bureaucrat, and you are promoting a scheme and the scheme doesn't work. Does your salary get docked? No. Bureaucrats are promoted based on their seniority. Nothing to do with whether or not the projects that they are doing are successful or not. So there is no incentive for feedback mechanisms in government. So the projects could fail, and then new projects would come about on the same thing and fail again because we haven't learned from our mistakes. And they're poorly aligned incentives. The incentive may not be to get the best possible result. The incentive may be to keep all the stakeholders happy, which may or may not be the right incentive. So to avoid this Nirvana fallacy, we must assume that government intervention, we must not assume, that government intervention will be better than imperfect markets. We have to assume that both governments and markets are imperfect, and we have to compare real world choices between imperfect markets and imperfect governments. So just because there is market failure does not mean that the government is the solution. That is Nirvana fallacy. We have to analyze what the government is doing and compare. And that's really important. It's a very difficult task also, but this is what public policy is about, to compare between real world choices. Imperfect markets, imperfect governments, you weigh them. So before I move on, I have actually more time for questions. I want to just show you a slide on the fact that rulers change, but policies don't. On a variety of issues, the Congress government stance before the BJP government came over, and the BJP government stance as governments, not as political parties, have been the same. Whether it be on Narega, they support it. Whether it be on privatization, which they oppose. I mean, I've heard a lot about it, but the government hasn't really done something about it. Or even on the indiscriminate use of the sedition law, the last line. So we have seen, sedition law being used against journalists, for example, right now in Gujarat. And we complain a lot about the current government's use of sedition law. But the previous government also used sedition law against its so-called enemies. So if you look at it, rulers may change, but often policies don't. So if you want to know more, I'll take questions now. But the best thing to do is to come to our e-policy. The next one is on 30th and 31st of May. It's from 10 a.m. to 6 p.m. on both days. And the application deadline is on the 18th of May. So you can go to our website, ccs.in/e-policy, or you can email Astha at astha@ccs.in. So I'm happy to take questions right now. Astha, do you want to read the questions to me, or shall I read them myself?
I can do it for you if you want.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay. So the first question, it's an anonymous question we have. Won't the study of choices before voting matter in case of free and fair elections, which is mostly not the case in India?
Okay. So this question is going to say that you don't have free or fair elections. So elections are unfair. I don't think that's true. By and large, elections in India are free and fair. There are issues, but it's not that the elections are completely rigged. We're not in countries where, like North Korea, where there's an election, but there's only one person standing. And if you don't vote for him, you most probably will be taken away and jailed. So elections are free and fair in India, most of the times. So the study of choices before voting does matter. But why don't we study them is not because the elections are free or fair or not. We don't study them because it is rational for us to be ignorant.
Okay.
Can we have the next question?
Yes, this is from the chat box. It says, how can one change incentives for bureaucrats?
That's a very difficult thing to do. How can one change incentives for bureaucrats? One way to do that is change the principal agent. So what we have is in a principal agent analysis, which I haven't talked about this time, is that the government is the agent. We are the principals. We as citizens tell the government what they should do. However, very often the government incentives are aligned differently. So how do we change those incentives? We can change it by making, instead of having a department which has unclear rules, to make the rules clearer. What's happened, for example, in the telecom department, where you now have 3 separate divisions, where there is one section of the telecom department that deals with licenses, one section that the TRI, which actually looks at solving problems, and a third section, which is a tribunal, which actually, so you separate out the 3 sections in a sense. That's one way of doing it. The other way of doing it is to have smaller government, to actually give the bureaucrats less work. So there is less incentive to do what they need to do.
This is a question from Vijay.
Yes.
He says, are we defining the role of government through our political and economic views?
How else do we define the role of government? We have to define them through our political and economic views and our social views as well.
Okay, moving on. The next question is by Anushka. She asks, if the government isn't able to address market failures, what are the other ways?
That's a good question. Sometimes market failures can be addressed by the community itself. I'll give you an example of a public good, lighthouses. So lighthouses are a classic public good. They are both non-rival and non-excludable. You can't exclude a ship from seeing the light from a lighthouse. And if one ship is seeing it, it does not take away from another ship seeing the same light from the lighthouse. So they're a classic public good. Because of that, one assumes that only the government can do it. Because if the government doesn't build lighthouses, there is no incentive for anybody else to build lighthouses, because they may not make any money out of it. However, as we've seen, there was a very famous study on lighthouses done by the economist Ronald Coase, who found out that a lot of lighthouses along the coast of England were built by an association of ship owners, not by the government. So as a community, they came together and built lighthouses, which is a classic public good. So that's one way of addressing a market failure. It was addressed by the community. Another way of addressing market failures is what we call the Coase bargaining, where Ronald Coase talked about if there are 2 factories next to each other, one of them is, say, a coal smelting or a metal smelting factory, which is belching out pollution. And the next one is, say, a laundry, which is keeping its clothes out to dry. And then the pollution is actually making the clothes dirty. So one way of solving that is to have the government say, okay, you can't pollute, and close down a factory. Another way of doing that is for the 2 factories to bargain amongst each other and then decide which one is either able to pollute or not pollute. I'm giving you a very simplistic answer to this question. It can be developed much more, but I want to take more questions right now.
Yes, sure. The other one is, if policies aren't changing when government changes, what role can public choice play in the same?
Once again, a good question. If policies aren't changing when the government changes, what role can public choice play? Public choice actually expects us to see the government in a better light, and also wants us to explore what are the incentives, the interests, the information that we get. So public choice plays a role of, at least at the very beginning, to show us the way government is behaving. And it does play a role in somewhat changing what the government does. At this point of time, we've seen that it hasn't happened, but it may be happening next time. I am more optimistic that perhaps that's the answer.
Okay. Should we move on, Yazad?
Yes, please.
Okay. The other question is from Vineet. Are there any countries where citizens are far more engaged in understanding their choices before casting their vote?
Some of them, like in Switzerland, where they vote on even smaller things in referenda. So, but in many countries, you have rational ignorance. I know, for example, especially in the United States, there's rational ignorance. So there are very, very few countries where people actually take the time out to study about before they vote.
We have another question that can you suggest us some books on this topic?
There are many books on this topic. The Center for Civil Society has a little primer also, which is on our website on public choice. What I can do is if you can write an email to me, I can suggest more books that way.
Okay. Moving on, another anonymous question. How might we get citizens to proactively engage in policy making? For example, in the current data privacy/protection bill, why aren't citizens more involved? Is it because there are no channels for citizens to engage?
Citizens have many, many other things to do. You need to, work. You need to bring in the bread for the family. You need to take care of them. So this is lower down the list of priorities for most people. We have to take that into account. That's the first thing. The second reason why citizens aren't that involved is because there is this apathy of whether or not they can make a difference. So this is something that we need to change, that you can make a difference, but there is a cost even to political organizing. I mean, when I say political organizing, I don't mean joining a political party, but even to kind of take part in an agitation or to take part in public policy, you need to take the time and the effort out of other things that you are doing. And this is not high on the list of anybody's priorities, or at least most people's priorities. That's why we see this apathy. Next.
Thank you. So there's a question in the chat about whether Ronald Coast's solution is applicable to Delhi pollution.
Yes. There was an article written by, I think, Shruti Rajagopalan, but I'm not sure, where it talked about the fact that the Delhi government could actually perhaps pay Punjab farmers not to burn the stubble. So yes, theoretically, it is applicable. There are ways of doing it. Whether or not it can be achieved in public policy is a different question. But there were suggestions made and even published in newspapers about, the Delhi government paying the polluters not to pollute. Next.
I'm not sure if you had already taken this, is it? If policies aren't changing when government changes, what role? You have already taken this, right?
I've taken this.
Just give us a second. Look at the questions in the chat box too. So there's another question we had missed off, Yazad. It's asking essentially if there can be a watchdog to ensure that freebies which help politicians and voters are in check.
Who's going to watch the watchdog? So when we look at this kind of solution, the important thing is to answer is it going to solve the problem? Just because we have a watchdog who is going to say that, these freebies are allowed or these freebies aren't allowed, who's going to watch the watchdog? Do we have a system of doing that? The answer to, having fewer freebies that governments give out is, in a sense, economic development. If we have greater economic development, then people generally don't need the freebies. But even in developed countries, you see that there are certain special interests. For example, in the United States or Europe, the special interests are farmers groups who get a lot of freebies. Why? Because it may cost $1 out of the ordinary voter's pockets. So just imagine a politician going around picking a rupee from your pocket and doing that to a lakh citizens. So you're picking 1 rupee from a lakh citizens. So you're getting a whole lakh of rupees. And then you give that lakh of rupees to a special interest group. Now, the citizens from whom that 1 rupee is taken really don't care because it's only 1 rupee. It doesn't matter that much. But the special interest, which gets that 1 lakh of rupees, really cares because it's a lakh of rupees. And then what you do is you lobby the government to get that special interest. So even in more advanced democracies and richer countries, we still have this question of freebies. Have I answered that question correctly, or should we move on?
Yes, there is another question here from on the chat from Ruchi. She's asking, what is the future of public policy courses in India? As in youth who are studying public policy and coming to work, what do you think are the possibilities in future career?
So you can actually work in public policy in a variety of ways. One is to work for think tanks like us. Another is to actually work for government. So to advise the government, and there are a lot of such positions that are open. The third is to work at private companies. So I know, for example, most top companies have public policy departments, which talk about, what avenues that they have. The best people to actually get to answer this question is the Indian School of Public Policy. So the Indian School of Public Policy has a 1-year course that they are doing, and their applications, I think, just get over in the next few days. So you should go to ispp.org.in. They have even more answers to this question.
There was a follow-up question on freebies, Yazid, on whether fiscal caps or can stop freebies and whether there are lessons from other parts of the world which has stopped freebies.
The best way to stop freebies is to give people cash. Don't give them freebies. Actually give people cash. Direct cash transfers. So, however, having the kind of who is going to put on the fiscal cap? The same government that's giving out the freebie? You have to ask, how is the political process going to work? So one part of public choice tells you that, the questions are easier, the answers can be much tougher. So in this case, if you want to put a fiscal cap, it's the same people who are giving out the freebies. How do you expect them to put the fiscal cap on? Next.
Is this question already answered? When people are toiling to bring food to a table, how do you expect people to make an informed choice? No. Yeah, so this is a bit two-part question. So part one is when people are toiling to bring food to a table, how could we expect people to make an informed choice? And is there a way we could solve this problem?
When people are toiling to bring food, we're all toiling to bring food to the table. How do you make an informed choice about this? It's very difficult to make an informed choice. The only way to make it is to actually study what the alternatives are. So this is a big problem. How do we solve this problem? Maybe we can't. We have to expect this problem to be there in some form or the other. In some form or the other, there are people who are going to make a choice that is not informed. There is going to be especially that we see this in countries today, there is going to be some amount of increased polarization. We see great polarization in India, for example, between caste structures and caste groups. You're also seeing polarization in India between the right wing and the left wing. So people then use identity politics to make decisions, and they're not making an informed choice. And it's true even in other countries where you have people who choose to vote based on certain identities instead of based on informed choice. Sometimes the study of these processes just shows us what the problems are. The solutions are much tougher. And I don't want to sit here and give a glib answer and say, okay, this is the way we solve it if these things can happen. I'd rather be honest and say that perhaps the solution is going to elude us.
Thank you. As a follow-up to that was in the light of increasing polarization of many democratic countries, where rather than collective action, people play we are the truth, they are the false. How could we make sure the common man is not swayed? But I think most of this you already covered in your previous
How could
answer
we make sure
itself.
the common man is not swayed?
Yes.
There are actually two answers to that. One is we assume that the common man is swayed easily. That's not true. People are making rational choices. So even in the terms of ignorance, when you are not making an informed choice, that can be rational for you, because making an informed choice is an investment of time and effort that you don't feel is worth the returns it gives you. So it's actually a rational choice. So the common man is not being swayed in that sense. The other thing is that this polarization, as I've told you before, for identity politics may not be solvable. There's a question, I just opened the chat, the Q&A window. There's a question on media that I've seen. Can I answer it?
Yeah, I was just coming to that. You can go ahead, ask that.
So what structure to use on fixing democracy through democratizing media, for profit or not for profit? Are you talking about having not for profit media? Why do you want to determine the structure? Let the media determine their own structure. When you want to say that you have free speech, the crucial question to answer is, are you okay with free speech that you don't agree with? So I think certain media houses are doing a terrible job. But if we have to have free speech, we have to let them do the terrible job. Because any other kind of forcing a structure on them is actually going to go against free speech. So I would say let the media be. It's not palatable. It's not a palatable answer, because we would like the media to be fair and be unbiased and all of those things. And very often it is not. But forcing it to be fair and unbiased depends on who is the watchman once again, who is going to force them to do it. And are you sure that that body is going to be fair and unbiased? So that's a bit romantic as well. So I would just let the media be. Any other questions?
Yeah, I can see one more. How do privileges and marginalization of minorities affecting choice making in policy? Even though they are appealed to the most in elections, they seem to be suffering. What role can bureaucrats play here?
I'll answer the last question first. What role can bureaucrats play here? I don't think there should be any clear role for bureaucrats out here. How do privileges and marginalization of minorities affecting choice making in policy? Even though they are appealed to, yes, because the politicians want their vote, but don't want to do anything for them. just because, I mean, this is again a tough question to answer. And the basic answer to this question is politicians want people's votes, but they would prefer to pander to special interests. So the way to solve this is one, to make sure that instead of having special interests, you do a direct cash transfer to the poor people. And two is a more general answer, is to have smaller government. The smaller the government is, the freer the economy is. Have a greater free market economy. Let the market do much more, because the market actually is quite fair in that sense. So we are putting too much of emphasis on elections and government. Let's also put some emphasis on the other ways to collective action, to community, to markets, and they can take a lot more on. Any other questions?
No, yes, I do not see any at the moment. So thank you so
We
much.
still have
You're
like 2
also-
minutes if you want to communicate anything to the audience.
Yeah. So almost at the end of our time.
John, 1 second. I think
I'm sorry?
I think my screen is Actually, we have 2 more minutes, you said, right?
Yes. Yes.
What I actually want to talk about in these 2 minutes is what a certain question that I asked earlier. What is the solution to some of these problems? And I want to say that instead of thinking just about solutions, especially as sometimes we would come up with a simple solution that looks very nice to us, but may not actually tackle the problem, it might be instructive to actually dive deep into what the problems are and get an idea of what the actual problem is, not the superficial problems. So for example, if you look at it, is poverty the actual problem? Or is it that people aren't able to fend for themselves? Is it that there are government structures that block entrepreneurs, small entrepreneurs, from doing what they can do? Is it that the system is, I mean, if you want to sell fruits in the market as a street vendor, there are so many difficulties you would have. You would have the police coming and beating you up and taking away your carts. You would have the bureaucrats wanting their cut, and you know, the petty officials who would want a bribe from you. So we don't see that very often. We don't see that people are being forced to stay in poverty through these strictures. And perhaps we need to study these problems a little more, instead of saying, okay, the solution is the government should do this, 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 this. That's rarely, if ever, the solution. I can hear some birds sing, and I think that's a lovely sound to end this entire talk with. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Yazad, for taking our time and sharing some useful information with all of us early in the morning. It was great to have you.
And I can see Rajesh is already here.
Yes. So everybody who's tuned into the session, thank you so much for joining in. We will be starting our next session at 11:05 sharp. Please be there. It will be great to have you.